You've been lied to about nutrition for over 40 plus years now, and it's why rates of chronic illness and obesity are at all-time highs, and they're continuing to get worse. And there's a few things that changed right around the year of 1977 with some dietary guidelines released by some three-letter agencies that certainly changed the way we view nutrition. And by the look of this graph here, going from 1970 up until the present day now, obesity rates have gotten worse and worse and worse since these guidelines were released. Yes, this is a correlative inference that I'm making, but there's reason to speculate as to why obesity rates, rates of chronic illness and disease have gotten worse since these guidelines came out. And I'm going to go over each one of these things, each one of these guidelines, and which ones may pertain to you and which ones may not, so you know exactly what you should be doing to optimize your health, reduce your risk for chronic illness, keep your body fat percentage as low and as healthy as possible so you can achieve optimal health and get the body transformation that you're looking to see. So back in 1977 here in the States, they released a comprehensive set of dietary guidelines that really shifted the way that we view nutrition and our diet on a day-to-day basis. And there was many other countries such as the United Kingdom, Finland, Japan, and others that followed these same trends once these guidelines were released. Now, I'm not saying that X causes Y here. I'm not drawing causation, saying that these dietary guidelines have caused us to get to where we are today. But what I am drawing is some level of correlation. There is a level of correlation here, especially since the late 1970s, we've noticed this negative trend in the wrong direction in so many different ways based off that graph that I shared earlier. So just to clarify before we jump in, I'm not drawing causation, I'm drawing correlation, but we certainly have reason to speculate and ask a few questions here because there's a few things that are off. So I'm going to go over each one of these guidelines and we're going to see if each one of these pieces of advice and these guidelines are actually going to be in alignment with what you're looking to accomplish for yourself right now in respect to your health and your body. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So the first of the guidelines is to reduce your overall fat intake from 40 to 30% of your total calories. So basically following a low-fat diet. Now, if you've watched my content before, you know that I certainly am a fan of including dietary fat into your diet from good natural sources, from monounsaturated fat, fattier cuts of fish, and saturated fat, which we'll touch on later on here, because those two fat sources are not going to trigger a response from the hormone insulin. Insulin is an anabolic hormone that is responsible for growth. It can grow good things like your muscles here, or they can grow bad things like your fat tissue, fat around your skin, or fat around your organs. Now, when insulin is low, you don't store fat, but when insulin is high, you do. And when you eat just pure dietary fat and nothing else, you do not see a response from this hormone because there is no sugar in saturated or monounsaturated fat. Sugar is what causes an insulin response to begin with. So we know that we don't trigger a response from the hormone that dictates how much body fat we lose or gain when we eat pure saturated or monounsaturated fat from a natural source, right? Trans fat, okay, that's different. Some unhealthy polyunsaturated fat, that's going to be different, right? But from a healthy source of fat, we are not going to see any problems. And when you're cutting down your fat intake so low and you're following a low-fat diet, you're going to have to replace it with something that does cause a very strong and negative insulin response, right? So you're really stacking the odds against you when you're following a low-fat diet, and you're also putting yourself in a position to miss out on fat-soluble nutrients such as vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K2, otherwise known as choline, and you're also missing out on the additional satiety that would come from eating higher fat and higher protein animal foods. Sure, you can get plenty of satiety from pure protein, but it definitely makes your food taste better when you have some added butter, 85-15% ground beef instead of the super lean 93-7%. And you're also getting those additional nutrients, and you're getting extra satiety. So you're actually preventing any sort of overeating as well. So that's why I'm not a huge fan of this guideline, and I've helped so many career-driven professionals, both men and women, all around the world by optimizing their diet for their specific situation. And many of them were eating a solid amount of dietary fat. They weren't all eating the exact same amount. Some were following a 1-to-1 fat to protein ratio, some 2-to-1, some eating a decent amount of monounsaturated fat and maybe not as much saturated fat. Of course, it's all tailored to their situation, but they were eating fat. They were eating more in the way of dietary fat, and they were not following this specific guideline. And if you want more information about the transformations and how they were able to see 30, 40, 50 pounds plus of weight loss and losing all their belly fat by eating more dietary fat, all the information is listed down below in that client transformation overview on the top of the video description, since I don't have time to break down each transformation. So the next is reducing your saturated fat intake to less than 10% of your calories, right? So I know we touched on this earlier, that eating saturated fat and monounsaturated fat is good for you. And I certainly agree with the fact that eating more in the way of saturated fat is certainly going to be beneficial to you based on what we went over earlier, right? You don't see a response from insulin. You're getting more in the way of fat-soluble vitamins such as vitamin A, D, E, and K2, and you're also getting more in the way of satiety, right? So if we don't see any sort of response from the hormone that dictates how much body fat we lose or gain, we're not going to put ourselves in a negative situation. And I made a whole video breaking down why eating more in the way of saturated fat is actually good for you. It's a great fat loss nutrient, and why it actually doesn't cause all these horrible chronic illnesses that everybody talks about online, such as heart disease, hypertension, atherosclerosis, etc. And I'll go ahead and link that video down below in the video description. But just to save you a little bit of time in case you don't have time to watch that, literally in that video, I break down all these different randomized control trials, basically showing how eating more in the way of red meat, eating these higher fat, higher protein animal foods, and a lot of saturated fat doesn't really cause, a big rise in your blood sugar levels, a big rise in your insulin levels, and a higher risk for type 2 diabetes and all these different chronic illnesses. And if anything, what they found the results in these different studies, especially the meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, which is a big super study that looks at a multitude of different controlled studies. And what they found there is that there was a reduction in insulin levels, a reduction in blood glucose levels, and an improvement in what's called HOMA-IR values, which is a biomarker for insulin resistance. So they found that there is an improvement in insulin resistance, which is the root cause of type 2 diabetes, a reduction in blood sugar, and a reduction in insulin levels in a meta-analysis, a giant group of studies, of multiple studies that are all randomized control trials that yield causation. So when you control each one of the variables in a study, you are more than likely going to get a causative outcome where X causes Y if the result is significant in comparison to, let's say, an observational study or a survey study where they just ask you a couple of questions and they say, oh, we found this result, right? That's going to draw correlation, like what we talked about earlier. Now, once again, if you want more information on saturated fat and you want the details of those studies that I broke down in that video, once again, it's down in the video description. But saturated fat is certainly going to be a healthy option for the majority of people. So once again, I disagree with this guideline. So increase carbohydrate intake from 28 to 48% of daily calories, making grains the foundation of the diet. I completely disagree with this. Now, this is not universal though, because there are going to be certain people based on your current status of metabolic health, how much body fat you're looking to lose, and all the context put together. There's going to be certain people that do better with eating more in the way of carbohydrates in comparison to, let's say somebody that's looking to lose more in the way of belly fat, they have a slower metabolism, that person may not respond as positively to certain types of carbohydrates like the person that is leaner, that's just looking to lose, let's say 5 to 7 pounds of body fat, right? So the context is important. Your carbohydrate notch is really going to change based on how much body fat you're looking to lose, how fast your metabolism is, and how you actually respond to the fuel that comes in. So if you have a slow metabolism, if you respond very negatively to carbohydrates already, and you know that when you have a big weekend where you just eat whatever you want, you eat a lot of carbohydrates, that you put on weight very quickly due to that slow metabolism and due to you not responding to that fuel very well, and you're also not very active, you're someone that should really control your carbohydrate intake for now, right? Not completely eliminate it, but you shouldn't have it as the main foundation of the diet, especially whole grains, which really don't have much at all in the way of bioavailable nutrient content, bioavailable meaning nutrients that you can absorb and utilize in comparison to things like red meat, right? A tenderloin is going to have vitamin A, D, E, and K2, right? And it's going to have all the water-soluble vitamins, B1 through B12, and many others. But whole grains, they really just have some water-soluble vitamins and a few other minerals, and that's about it. And it's not the worst food in the world, but it's really just an incomplete, very low, nutrient-dense food. Doesn't have that much in the way of nutrients. It just has a lot of carbs, right? And depending on your current situation, it could be a negative outcome for you if you are someone that's not as metabolically healthy. Now, if you're someone that is a bit leaner, you can certainly get away with having it every now and then, no problem, if not consistently. If you are someone that is certainly falling towards the person that has a faster metabolism, is a bit leaner and is more active and responds very positively to carbohydrates, you can do well with it and you can do fine, right? But it's just not the best option, especially since whole grains are usually processed to a certain extent as well when you're trying to turn it into a loaf of bread, right? So single ingredient food that is mainly animal foods and naturally sourced carbohydrates, fruits, vegetables, and occasionally some rice are definitely going to be the better options for the foods that you want to go with here. But to say that universally, 28 to 48% of your total calories should be coming from carbohydrates just doesn't make that much sense if we're not really thinking about the context here. That 28 to 48% is somewhat vague, right? I mean, there's a bit of a range there, but for somebody to eat, half of their diet from carbohydrates and the majority of their diet coming by way of carbohydrates, especially if some of them are somewhat processed like the whole grains and are very low in nutrients and can cause somewhat of a strong insulin response at times where you shoot your blood sugar and your insulin levels somewhat high, that's going to be problematic for the wrong person, right? That shouldn't be following that particular diet. Now, I'm not saying that universally everybody should follow a low-carb diet. This just comes back to finding your carbohydrate notch that's going to work for you and your specific situation, right? If you're someone that's a bit leaner, you can get away with eating more in the way of carbohydrates and some whole grains and other processed carbs maybe occasionally, right? But if you're someone that has belly fat and you have a slow metabolism and you respond very negatively to the fuel that comes in, for now, you should not make carbs the main component of your diet if you're struggling with those different issues, which are really underlying symptoms of what's called metabolic syndrome, right? Where you're also dealing with brain fog and maybe even taking steps towards insulin resistance, which can kickstart type 2 diabetes and other issues, right? You should control that for now, control insulin, eat higher fat, higher protein animal foods, and just make that the main component of the diet, and carbohydrates secondary with somewhat of a lower notch, but maybe not all the way down to zero, so you can make it sustainable, and then you can slowly increase it. And I've done this for so many people, and I've helped so many individuals do this all around the world, and it just all comes down to your current status of metabolic health. And I made a whole free video down below talking about this particular subject, how to know what sort of diet you should be eating based off your current status of metabolic health and specifically your carbohydrate notch. I will link that down below in the video description in case you would like to check that out as well. It's very, very helpful. So next is to reduce cholesterol intake to no more than 300 milligrams per day. Now, this has been debunked. Recently, this is no longer even a part of the dietary guidelines anymore, mainly because cholesterol is a very anabolic nutrient. And there is, without going down a crazy physiological rabbit hole here, eating more in the way of dietary cholesterol can actually improve the production of testosterone in the human body as well. So it can actually help you build more in the way of muscle and get more of the benefits that do come from higher levels of testosterone. So all the guys out there that are struggling with lower levels of testosterone, you feel like that's, the odds are being stacked against your favor as you're getting older, eating more in the way of dietary cholesterol can certainly be helpful, right? And usually you find dietary cholesterol in higher fat, higher protein animal foods as well, such as red meat. So the most nutrient-dense foods, such as red meat and these higher fat and higher protein animal foods, are the ones that are really being demonized in these guidelines, right? And these foods end up getting replaced with processed sources of carbohydrates or too much in the way of even naturally sourced carbohydrates that just continue to spike your blood sugar and your insulin levels too often and too high to the point to where you run into problems and you're not even getting the necessary nutrients and the beneficial nutrients like cholesterol and other vitamins that you would find in animal foods. So once again, I disagree with this one. including cholesterol into your diet without getting meticulous with it is definitely going to be something that is beneficial to you, right? Cholesterol on its own in the diet is not going to be problematic. And as long as you are following a diet that is going to be tailored to your specific situation and it's following the guidelines of your specific primary care physician and your doctor, you're going to be fine, right? But there's basically little to no evidence out there that shows that reducing cholesterol intake from the diet is going to dramatically improve your health and is going to put you in this position where you're bulletproof safe from type 2 diabetes and all these other issues. And if anything, you're going to be trending in the wrong direction if you are cutting out these animal foods and cutting out cholesterol, because you would have to cut out animal foods or most of them if you're going to try and reduce your cholesterol intake to 0. Now, the next one is to reduce your salt intake to no more than 5 grams per day. I disagree with this one as well, because salt is very important for nerve transmissions and muscular contractions and many other human bodily functions that are fully essential that come from getting more in the way of electrolytes and getting more in the way of sodium, which is what we really want to get if we're adding more salt into our diet. There's a reason why mammals like elk or certain deer go to salt licks or go to rocks to lick up some salt, because they need that. They're constantly on the move. They need to make sure that their nerve transmissions are on point and their muscles are contracting in the right way, right? That's why many athletes will end up cramping if they're not getting an adequate amount of electrolytes. So it is important, especially if you're training consistently, to get a decent amount of sodium into your diet. Now, you don't have to be meticulous with the exact number. You just, in order to make this simple, really all you have to do is just listen to your natural human bodily cues. Salt to taste, right? If the food is just way too salty, your body's already telling you that you're eating too much in the way of salt, or you put too much salt in your food. Now, if the food tastes super, super bland and there's just no flavor, get to that neutral state and just add an adequate amount of salt to the point to where you feel satisfied and it's not too salty and it's not too bland either. Now, of course, you want to follow the advice of your primary care physician or your doctor if you're somebody that is predisposed to hypertension or other issues that are related to salt intake. Of course, you want to make sure it's moderate, but to say that universally for everyone, no matter where you fall on the spectrum of hypertension or whatever it may be, that we should all just completely cut out salt and keep it under 5 grams per day is a bit silly, right? I mean, 5 grams can be pushing it for certain people, but there's going to be others that can definitely get away with eating more salt than the average person if they're an athlete. And there's going to be some of you that may need, depending on the day, depending on human bodily functions and how your body's actually operating, you may need a little bit more salt than you may think. And especially if you're somebody that's noticing cramps, and if you're noticing that you're dealing with some brain fog and you're just not feeling right, and you know that you're not adding as much salt into your diet because of this guideline or because of whatever advice you heard on the internet, just try adding a little bit more salt to your diet. You don't have to dump it on, but at least salt to taste, right? It may not be as high as 5 grams, but cutting it way below 5 grams and having it close to 0 or just far too low just doesn't make that much sense if you're somebody that is dealing with issues without having that much salt in your diet. Find what works for you, salt to taste, make sure you listen to your primary care physician, especially if you're somebody that is predisposed to having issues with hypertension or any other chronic illness that is related to increased salt consumption. But if you're not in that area, and if you're not somebody that is dealing with those issues, then you can certainly find a salt intake that's going to work for you naturally by just listening to your bodily cues. The last recommendation is to increase consumption of poultry, fish, and plant-based proteins while decreasing red meat intake. I partially agree with the fact that we should increase our consumption of poultry, animal foods, fish. We get more omega-3 fatty acids by consuming fattier cuts of fish, such as sardines, mackerel, anchovies, salmon, and herring. But to say that we should really make plant-based protein a priority and decrease red meat intake, you already know, if you've been watching up to this point, why I would disagree with something like that, just because you're missing out on all the great nutrient content and the benefits that would come from eating red meat. Now, the reason why I'm not the biggest fan of having plant-based protein as the main priority of your diet over animal-based protein is because usually the individual plant protein option that you're going with is going to be an incomplete protein source that does not have what's called all 9 essential amino acids. So whenever a protein source is incomplete, it just doesn't have all 9 essential amino acids. And these essential amino acids are crucial for inducing what's called muscle protein synthesis, which is the synthesis and the growth of new muscle, right? You build more muscle, you boost your metabolism so you can burn more in the way of body fat. And you're making that more difficult, that whole process, whenever you are making plant-based protein the main priority over animal-based protein, just because you're not getting that complete protein source each time. Plus, the problem with plants is that most of them do have a lot in the way of anti-nutrients, such as oxalates, lectins, isothiocyanates, and many others that are designed to hold onto their nutrient content and pass it down over to the next generation. Because plants can't punch you in the face and attack you aggressively like a human can or a mammal, right? That can, jump out and grab you like a tiger, right? Plants have to defend themselves passive aggressively, right? So they may mess up your thyroid hormone a little bit or give you some brain fog whenever you eat their plant, especially the most highly defended part of the plant being the seed. So not everybody responds to these anti-nutrients the same way. Everybody responds differently to different substances and different compounds, right? So just test how you feel after eating some of these plant-based foods. If you feel somewhat lethargic or you have some brain fog after eating some spinach, for example, just try cutting that out for a couple of days or to a week and then see how you feel once you make that adjustment. Maybe it had nothing to do with the spinach, maybe it was something else, but it's something that you can test. Now, once again, not everybody's going to respond the same way. There's going to be people that respond just fine to some spinach or some leafy greens, and others that may have a negative reaction to it. Anti-nutrients do exist, but it does not affect everybody in the exact same way. And we do need more research on this particular subject as well, just so we can get a better understanding of how we actually respond to these anti-nutrients based on our current state of physiology as well. So the two biggest issues with plant-based protein options is the protein sources are incomplete and they're usually not going to help you build as much in the way of muscle. And there's certain plants that do cause certain issues with certain people because of their anti-nutrient content, but once again, it's not going to be the same for everyone. So to say that we should have a protein option like that as a main priority over animal-based protein, which does have all 9 of those essential amino acids, no matter what animal protein option you pick, which will help you induce muscle protein synthesis. Not only that, it also has no anti-nutrient content because once again, mammals will defend themselves aggressively. So they don't need this passive-aggressive mechanism to mess up your thyroid hormone a little bit whenever you eat a piece of meat from a cow or any other animal that you decide to eat, right? So I basically disagree with each one of these guidelines, and that's why we've started to notice this negative trend in the wrong direction, right? Once again, like I said in the beginning of the video, I'm not drawing causation here, but there may be a few things in here that I listed off already that you are doing. You are following some of these guidelines, but you're not seeing the results that you want to see in the mirror. You're not seeing your body change. Your health is still suboptimal. You're still dealing with brain fog, and you're still dealing with some underlying health issues as well, yet you're listening to this conventional advice. And if you're someone that is in that situation, I just advise you to change at least 1 or 2 of the things I went over that you may be following that you feel like has the biggest impact on your day-to-day life and your day-to-day diet and nutritional habits. Make those changes first and make sure they're subtle. Don't make drastic changes and slowly transition into this. And then just ask yourself how you're feeling after 2 weeks. And then how you're feeling after 4 weeks if you want to continue. If you're noticing this positive trend in the right direction instead of a negative trend in the wrong direction, then that's how you know you've made the right adjustment for your particular physiology and your particular situation so you can see more in the way of results with your health, with your body, and you're actually moving in the right direction and you're moving away from chronic illness, obesity, and just having more in the way of body fat. So that is pretty much it for this video. I hope you found this one valuable. I know we certainly took a deep dive into a lot of science into each one of these guidelines, but I wanted to make sure that you guys had as much in the way of validation as possible with each one of these points, and you feel fully equipped and feel ready to take on any sort of change that you may need to make after watching this video. So other than that, that's pretty much it. Feel free to follow me on Instagram down below in the video description at It's Bobby O'Brien. Feel free to check out any of those other videos that I mentioned here on this YouTube channel. Smash that like button, leave a comment if you like this video, and if you want me to make more content like this in the future. If there's any topics that you want me to cover later down the line, I would be happy to cover them. So that's pretty much it, and I will see all of you in the next video.